Hi, it's Brendon, the Technology Concierge. Today I'm joined by David Stallworthy from the Reivernet group of companies. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Brendon.
David, if I had to summarise what the Reivernet group of companies does, I'd say you basically build and manage complex networks for global hotel chains. Would that be right, or am I simplifying it?
No, that's correct. At the simplest form, we design, build, configure, document, manage and support complex networks for the hotel industry. We've been doing that for 20 years. We also, in the last couple of years, have branched out into other verticals, being healthcare. We've done some government work, and we're working with the building industry more closely.
Okay, that's cool. For the audience benefit, we worked together 22 years ago, back in the early days of the internet. I know it's hard to believe that we look so young, but I remember spending time at the Qantas Lounge. We're actually helping guests connect to the internet via a serial connection, pre-Ethernet. A lot has changed. I would suspect that most guests now are actually connecting to the network via Wi-Fi.
Yes.
So definitely a lot has changed in 22 years, but when I look, a lot has changed in the last 5 years as well. Why are networks much more complex now than they were 5 years ago?
Good question. So when you and I work in the Qantas Club Lounge, hotels were opening with a telephone network and a TV network and a network for their security system. And in the last sort of 5 or 10 years, the networks have become converged, meaning that an owner can put in one network or one set of infrastructure that all the services can layer over the top of.
And there's a cost benefit, I assume. Obviously, one network infrastructure, but also, does that make it easier to manage or harder to manage?
Well, it makes it more complex because now all the parties that are on that network need to be working to the same standards and to the same, effectively, language.
Yep. So the networks are much more complex, and you ideally need someone to take ownership of the network and manage it, right?
Yes, there needs to be a policeman.
Yeah.
So somebody needs, a party needs to be accountable for the performance of that network and work with all the other parties that are residing on that network.
Yep. Okay. Because if you're operating individual networks, simple, you know where the problem lies. If you're running a converged network, which is quite complex, there's no way that you can have 6 or 7 different parties actually having access to adjusting configuration and stuff on the network. So
correct. One party needs to be appointed to look after the base infrastructure. And if we were to look at a network, be it at home or be it in a hotel, the components aren't that much different.
Yep.
You have your passive infrastructure, which is your cabling. That would typically have an investment life cycle of 10 or more years. You have your active equipment, which in an office or a hotel environment would be a firewall and network switches and access points. Mm-hmm. And that infrastructure would have a life cycle of 4 to 5 years. You have the connectivity to the network, which is the ISP, and then you have the applications that sit on top of the network. Now, a party needs to be accountable for the base network configuration and security, and then that party, or in the hotel industry, often the brand standards, mandate how the layered services will, one, join the network and the protocols with which they will join. And a brand standard, in its simplest form, is just a language everyone agrees to use. When we used to have separate networks running, then each vendor could run their network however they liked because they weren't interrupting or impacting anyone. Nowadays, for the network uptime, the performance of all the services on the network, it's very important that everyone agrees to the standards. Hence why the large hotel groups set out a standard for everyone to follow.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So I suppose the question then, David, is a hotel network much more complex than a standard business network? And what makes it more complex?
At its simplest form, it probably is more complex because in a converged network environment, which is what we're talking about, we have the hotel team that want to leverage the network.
Yep.
We have visitors.
Yep.
We have hotel guests. And with layered services from a group of suppliers on the network, they're also accessing the network. So to have all of those parties leveraging the network does make it more complex.
Yep.
And in addition, there is personal data being stored by the hotel or by some of the vendors,
Yep.
and there is also data being transferred. And so complexity is about keeping the network up and keeping it secure.
Yep. Okay. And when I think of a standard business network, you've effectively got your employees, maybe a visitor. So it's quite simple. Whereas, as you said, with a hotel
Yes.
network, you've got the team, which will have different levels of access. You've got your guests. You've got other suppliers running across that network as well.
Yes.
So security is key.
Yes.
Uptime is key as well.
Correct. And like in our office, we have a network for our team, and if visitors come in, they have a hotspot that is not even linked to our network. In a hotel environment, the guest traffic and the hotel traffic is sitting on the same network, but it is separated by the network manager.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. David, one of the things I see when I talk to hotels and do some consulting and stuff like that is, and I think it's human nature, we're all good at it. If we're looking for a new car, rather than actually sort of analyse what we want, is it 7 seats? Is it do we need towing capacity? Do we need somewhere for the dogs? First thing we do is we go to a car yard and we just start looking at cars and we
Do a test drive.
Yeah, test drive.
Yeah.
Even before we've potentially established our budget, right?
Yep.
In hotels, I see them doing the same thing. So they'll go out and they might be looking at a network or a property management system, and they'll start having demonstrations from vendors and they'll start getting pricing, yet they haven't defined really what their needs are, or their scope, as I'd call it. Why is it important that a hotel actually takes the time to scope out their requirements? And potentially, what are the implications if they don't?
Nice analogy. Yeah, this is the role that brand standards play. It ensures that a network that is deployed to a brand standard will support any of the operational or owner's decisions going forward on what services they wish to layer on the network.
Yep.
And the standards, depending on the group, cover a very wide range of circumstances, and they effectively form the scope part of the brief. And any network that has been deployed to the brand standards, the hotel should be able to, with confidence, make decisions on services they want to layer on the network, knowing that it will work.
Yep. Okay. So what's a good example of a hotel that you've seen potentially recently that have not implemented to brand standards, and then later on they've looked to put something on the network and it's like, oh, that's not going to work?
The bloopers reel of IT decisions.
And we could go for hours.
We could go for hours, but we won't. At the moment, the brand standards are often seen as something to aspire to.
Right, okay.
Whereas the brand standards should actually be seen as the minimum standards.
Yeah.
And so often in the past, there are decisions that are made of understanding the brand standard and then trying to cut some corners.
Yep.
And there are examples of wanting to put in labour efficiency applications that may support your driveway staff or your housekeeping staff, but a decision might have been taken previously to not extend the network into the housekeeping cupboards or areas, or into the car park or onto the driveway.
Yep.
And the brand standards are there for a reason, to support the ability to onboard services and applications quickly. But if decisions were taken in the past to cut corners on some of those implementations, then you may not run into those problems until you choose to select an application for an area that wasn't covered. The areas that I didn't used to think were important, that now, if I was to own a hotel, I'd want to cover, you want the hotel car park.
Yep.
You want the pool area.
Yep.
You want the spa area. The elevators, although they're expensive to cover,
Yep.
is great from a guest experience point of view because they're not falling over onto the mobile network.
Yep.
But also the staff efficiency in being able to be rerouted, either waiting for an elevator, in an elevator, I believe gives a very good ROI on why you want to cover elevators and the other areas of the hotel that on paper look expensive to get an access point to.
Yep. And in the future, when potentially we have robots that will want to travel in the elevator, they will need Wi-Fi access generally to determine what floor they're on and communicate with the elevator.
They will definitely need to know where they are at all times.
So that's a great example. So what we're saying then is, obviously scoping is critical. The brand standards are not, something to aspire to. They are actually a minimum. And if you do it right, then you are future-proofing yourself. Because as you said, you put your network in now, and then in 12 months' time or whatever, you want to add a labour efficiency tool. If you've done it properly, then you don't have any issues. If you haven't done it properly, then you'll find that literally, it won't work in back of house areas, and that'll only be available to your staff when they're in the guest room and on the floor, which makes it half a solution in a sense.
Yes. And the way I like to look at it is the simplicity of a hotel network is just like what we have at home. The things that cause issues with the family is coverage, speed.
Okay, David, I suppose a really good question is, what makes a good network?
Well, I guess the first part is understanding what are the components of a network.
Yep.
So, again, at a simplistic level, you've got the cabling, so the passive equipment. Then we've got the active equipment, which is in a hotel environment, is often a firewall, the switches, and the Wi-Fi points. The next component is the connectivity to the network, which is the ISP, which talks a lot to the performance of the network and the experience on the network. And then the last of the four are the layered services that go on top.
Yep. And cabling's important, even though I think a lot of people these days say, well, hasn't everything gone Wi-Fi? Why do we need cabling, right? But it's still the backbone of everything within a hotel network. There has to be a cabling infrastructure.
Correct.
And ideally to every room still, right? With, if we're talking brand standards and getting it right, from my understanding, if I was to build a hotel now or to recommend to somebody, I'd be saying, you cable to every room, you put a small access point with multi-port switch into the room, and then basically you've future-proofed yourself.
Yes, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
And, it's a good point about needing the cable infrastructure to go to the edges of the property. There was a perception for a period of time that if you just had Wi-Fi, you don't need cabling. You actually probably need more cabling to more areas to ensure that your coverage of Wi-Fi is complete.
Yep, because when we were working together years ago and Wi-Fi was just coming in, it was pre-smartphones, pre the iPhone, we would just going along and putting a couple of access points in a corridor and saying, great, you've now got Wi-Fi. These days, that doesn't cut it, both from a coverage point of view, but also from a speed point of view, right? You've got too many people sharing a couple of access points in the corridor. And I know I've personally stayed in hotels, and if I had the room to my door open, I could actually get Wi-Fi. But as soon as I shut the door, which is fire rated, I lost connectivity completely. Now, that's just not acceptable in today's world, right?
Connectivity is very important to everyone.
Yep.
Getting connectivity to all corners of the hotel, from the housekeeping closets to the car park, to the spa areas, even through the kitchen, is very important operationally for the hotel. One of the reasons, I understand that the brand standards have an access point in each room is to leverage the data port that is embedded in these access points. Yep. The TV and potentially the telephone are leveraging this access point, which is also your Wi-Fi coverage.
Yep.
If you were to put an access point in every second room, while you may have adequate coverage from a guest Wi-Fi and a communication point of view, you lose the ability in every second room to use the data point for the TV or for the telephone.
Yep.
And often those decisions to reduce CapEx have operational implications down the road.
Yep. I think you told me about a hotel that chose to put an access point in every second room, and then they were looking to deploy IP phones, unaware that they could only put a phone in every second room.
Yes. Yeah.
So they're the sorts of, when we talked about scoping earlier in our conversation, they're the sorts of things that if you had treated the brand standards as a minimum, then you really wouldn't have those problems moving forward.
Correct. And the data that comes out of the large hotel groups support that. Their ability to onboard suppliers is faster. The finger pointing is less because there is a standard that everyone agrees to. But the guest satisfaction scores that used to exist before COVID stopped those for a period of time were always higher in networks that met the brand standards.
Okay.
And that often talks to, just the coverage and potentially the amount of bandwidth that goes into the property.
That's great. David, I've seen a great diagram that sort of explains the network in a hotel. Would you like to run through that with us?
So that diagram was designed to share the simplicity of the concept of a data network. And it's no different to the networks that we all have at home or in our apartments, in that you have cabling in your house.
Yep.
You have access point or access points in the house.
Yep.
You have an ISP to your house, and you have services that sit on the network.
Yep.
Now, so often that when we go into a hotel environment and we look at the infrastructure in the computer room, it looks very complex. But that diagram, which I think you'll show here, has been simplified down to show that there are 4 components. There is the cabling. There is the active equipment, which is the switches and the firewall and the access points. There's the connectivity to the property. And then there are the applications that sit on top of the network. And it's in scoping your network going forward that we use that as a tool to help the hotel operators and owners think about what services they may want to layer on their network in the coming years, to ensure that they understand why, if you're cabling the hotel now, to cable to all the parts you may want to get to in the next 5-10 years, because your cabling infrastructure is, one, very expensive to put in, but 2, the next time you review a decision to upgrade the cabling is probably going to be in another 10 years. So you start with getting the cabling right. Then the brand standards talk to having a minimum set of commercially available hardware, and that talks to the uptime and the performance and the security that can be enabled on those devices, and that they can also support the number of solutions that would sit on the network going forward. It's my view that the infrastructure, the cabling and the network devices is an owner asset. We ultimately know the owners pay for pretty much everything that happens in the hotel. But the guest experience and the smooth operation of the hotel, is a decision that is probably led by the brands and the hotel operators around how much speed, what bandwidth they want to the property, and what applications they want to run their business and to support their guests. And so, again, going back to the diagram, the simplicity is there are 4 components. There's connectivity, there's cabling, there's network switches, and then layered services that sit on those networks.
So the owner should invest in, obviously, the cabling, the network equipment. And then from an operator point of view, they're probably responsible for delivery of bandwidth and then layered services. Are that how you'd sort of break up the 4 components?
Well, the other way of probably working backwards would be that whether it's a hotel or a school or some other use for the property, the cabling and the network switches will support any business that is in there. The connectivity that comes in, which supports the speed and the applications on the network, can often be driven by where the networks and the databases are sitting that are supporting the property. And then the applications are often quite specific to the type of use of the building, which means whoever's running the building probably wants to choose the services that they have in the building at the time. And as you and I know, there's it's important to have good communication, a lot of transparency between all the parties to ensure that you are making decisions that work for all parties. And the brand standards underpin all of that by creating a platform that everyone can agree on to then move forward with running the business.
Okay. And we've talked a lot about brand standards today, but I think what I'm hearing is that the brand standards are important. Obviously, you have a network that is going to deliver on your business requirements. The brand standards should be treated as not something to aspire to, but pretty much a minimum. And from what you're saying also, properties that operate to brand standards, experience, better uptime, better guest satisfaction results. Anything else?
I liken to the brand standards to a language.
Yep.
You know, one brand standard is not better to the other. It is a document that becomes the framework for what everyone can point to make decisions going forward and to have dispute resolution. So the standards aren't better from one group to the hotel. They typically at their centre have the owner interest at heart, which is longevity on investment.
Yep.
And it also supports the ability to be comfortable in making decisions about services that you want to layer onto the network. But it sets the framework for what all the parties and how they will engage with the network, which is focused on the uptime, the performance, and then the security of not only the data that's being transmitted across the network, but also where these networks then hold their databases.
Yeah.
And, you know, security is very important in today's age. As we know, every time we turn on the TV, there's another data breach. And your hotels are susceptible because they have so many visitors.
Yeah.
And that makes security often one of the sort of foundations of the brand standards for very good reason.
Yeah, you're quite right. Literally on the news today, there was a hotel in Singapore that was compromised earlier this year. Well-known brand, unfortunately. You know, it's a really great point. So, David, we've seen a lot of change, as we said, over the last 5 years. I don't think it's going to stop. There's going to be, you know, the one thing that we can guarantee is that, you know, change is inevitable. What do you think is going to happen over the next 5 years? I know you don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah.
But
so I think the first thing to agree on is that the fundamentals actually haven't changed. The components that make up a network are still the same as they were, 22 years ago when we worked together. The brand standards, or having a network standard and then having all the services operating on one network, has been the biggest change.
Yep.
If I was to look ahead for the next 5 years, I think the steps we've taken to get the hotel networks robust has been great. The next step is actually start getting redundancy in these networks.
Yes.
They are running the business day to day, minute to minute, and the points of failure need to be, even though networks, central switches don't fall over that often, they do. I think in the next 5 years we're going to see more redundancy of the weaker points on the network, which is effectively the bottlenecks.
Yep.
And if I was to look at sort of a second thing that might change in the next 5 years, is probably, I think the suppliers are going to start working better as we all get more experience to working to standards and working together on a single network. That's been a big learning curve for the whole industry. And I know that hoteliers spend a lot of time worried that vendors are going to point fingers. I think as we're all getting used to the language of what each hotel network is operating on, there is less finger pointing and there's more focus on getting the networks back up. But that does lead on to, starting to focus on who holds the data and the data records of the network.
Yep.
And there are two components to keeping a network up, which is physically, where is it? Often the need to find equipment is once it's failed.
Yeah.
That's
true.
And then we're running around trying to find the last as-built drawings. I think that there will be, a move to having the databases of physical locations centrally available, and not at the responsibility of the vendors. While the vendors may be responsible for uploading the data, I think we'll start seeing that information being held centrally. So all parties that are working on the network can see recent photographs and where the location is, and so that when they do need someone on site, they can find the location faster. And so that's the physical part. The next part is the logical, or the configuration of the network.
Yep.
Again, that information has been held, by the vendor that runs the network, which is the right place for it to be.
Yep.
And those networks are often maintained to a brand standard. But there needs to be backups of that data.
Yep.
And I think that we're going to see centralized databases where we can find and restore networks faster without having to fall back onto Excel or to some other database that is not shared. So I guess in summary, the changes we're going to see, I would envision in the next 5 years is probably more redundancy on the networks.
Yep.
So that we can sleep better at night, knowing that if something breaks, the network's not going to fall over. And then the key information about the network is centrally available and accessible to the parties that need access to it. That's
great. No, I love that. And I think as you know, our dependency on technology is now greater than it ever was. We're still a people business. I need to say that because a lot of hoteliers get concerned that technology will replace humans within the industry. I don't think that's ever the case. I think we just need to use technology to help us deliver on the service. And so what we're saying today is that, from 22 years ago, where, I remember going into a very large hotel chain and talking to them about the need for guest internet. And they said, no, guests will never need internet access. Dial-up is the way to go. And then literally, 12 months later, corporates were coming out with their basically, request for business documents, and they required, high-speed internet access. So a lot has changed. And I think, as you said, the network's become more important. We've not only got guests on the network, we've now got hotel staff on the network. We're seeing, cloud-based PABXs, cloud-based PMSs, a whole bunch of stuff. So you're quite right. The quality of the network is now more important than it ever was.
Yes, and I think one of the simple rules of thumb that I use to whether a hotel network or any network is fit for purpose is if people are talking about it. If
in a positive way or a negative way.
People expect that there is going to be good Wi-Fi.
Yep.
So nobody talks about it if it's fit for purpose.
Okay.
So if you walk into a Qantas Club lounge or into a hotel or into a building where they supply Wi-Fi and people are talking about it, there is typically an issue somewhere, be it coverage, be it speed. So, I guess one of the first measures I use as to whether there's a problem is if anyone's talking about it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, because we don't go into a hotel and say, I hope they've got hot water. It's an expectation, and it's now the same with Wi-Fi.
Yes.
So if you deliver excellent Wi-Fi, then you won't get comments about it. But if you don't, then people will be complaining, and then that's something that needs to be addressed.
And that brings it back to a hotel network is not that much more complex than a home network.
Yep.
If we get home and somebody complains about the Wi-Fi, something's gone wrong. You don't come home and people thank you for the Wi-Fi.
Very true.
And if there was one thing that I'd like to share with people, that hotel networks aren't that complex. They just look complex. But there are really just 4 components. And if those 4 components suit the business requirements, nobody's going to talk about it, and they're going to be able to make faster, better business decisions going forward.
David, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Brendon.